When it comes to Star Wars content under Disney, a lot of it is either bland and forgettable or terrible and insulting, and usually it's a combination of both. Nothing seems to be made out of a love of Star Wars anymore, and that's a damn shame. They're either mostly made by whack jobs who want to turn Star Wars into something else, with varying results of quality, or people who see Star Wars as a lucrative franchise to push their own personal agenda. None of them have any respect for George Lucas, yet still feel the need to rub over all the shit he made, and that's the central problem with Disney's Star Wars. A lack of respect for the source material, and secondary to that, they're all bland and forgettable, aside from the parts that make you really angry. Star Wars games under Disney are kind of a bit different though, because since Disney doesn't give a shit about the gaming industry, they're kind of a last resort for quality content. The problem was, they pawned off the license to Electronic Arts, one of the worst gaming publishers ever, and while they may have some competitors, surely there's someone else they could have went with. Thankfully, in recent years, they seem to have realized that going with different publishers and studios is a better idea, but it was fucking miserable the first half decade, where we barely got anything except Battlefront games with huge drawbacks that prevented you from enjoying them. And besides, Battlefront 2015 didn't even have a story, and the follow-up had a really bad story. So bad, in fact, that not even the most seasoned Disney Star Wars defenders shilled for it. So when it comes to content I actually liked amongst all this, there's the Jedi games were actually pretty decent, and actually come off like an actual appreciative love for Star Wars. But why? Why do the Jedi games seem to be the only thing in existence which came from Disney and is mostly controversy and scandal-free? I did have the explanation for the longest time that the Jedi games, being video games obviously, managed to have less intrusive oversight because Disney, again, don't give a shit about the gaming industry. And so that allowed Respawn Entertainment to put out an experience that wasn't corporatized in any way. Say what you will about Battlefront 2's revival, but the story was still awful, and the game didn't reach its full potential anyways. That's why it fell short. Now, I never said that the Jedi games were masterpieces, but its shortcomings are a result of things like a story that fell a little bit short, and technical issues, and maybe taking the gameplay a little too literally, but none of those problems have anything to do with pushing an ulterior agenda or insulting the fans. It's just a natural shortcoming in the development of the games. I mean, after all, having a protagonist that Snowflake's ripped on as a boring white male protagonist kind of exposed the hypocrisy of those people crying foul when it came to Moses Ingram or Amandla Stenberg, especially since the latter is the racist and not the other way around. But point is, given an actual protagonist that has no ulterior motive is a blessing, maybe we should only get white male protagonists from now on out if they prevent Disney's writers from being lazy and crying racism when their rubbish characters fall short. But that's a story for another time. That's not to say that there hasn't been questionable decisions made with the characters in the Jedi games. I mean, after all, Sam Maggot wrote an absolutely dogshit novel that was nothing but a lesbiano horny porny fanfiction surrounding Night Sister Merrin. Something that had no bearing on Jedi Survivor anyways, given both she and Cal Kestis hooked up in a heterosexual manner. So what was the point of that? But good thing that bullshit wasn't in the games themselves. It was just some idiot who admitted she didn't even play the game as extensively as you think would be necessary, as that's why the novel was full of errors, such as stating that Cal was Seer's Padawan, which is not the case, and tells you that she did analyze the story of Fallen Order very closely. It also tells you that she probably never spoke to Stig Asmussen or any of the writers concerning the game, and just went off the story how she remembered it from playing it a measly one time, which is the reason we get so many terrible Star Wars stories these days anyways. It's a lack of attention to detail, and writers just forgetting important things about Star Wars as originally written because they just took a shitty guess. But Sam Maggot's fuck-up aside, the Jedi games, because they were made as independently from the corporate mouse as possible, benefited in the long run because the writers weren't constrained by Kathleen Kennedy's idiotic ideas. It also probably explains why the Jedi games are so detached from the entire Disney canon to begin with. How it's a fresh slate, with new characters being the prominent ones, and more notable characters being second class, and not having that much bearing on the story. But as I've said alongside that, just because you give a studio more freedom doesn't mean they're automatically going to put out a good game. The reasons we got Star Wars Outlaws, and it was an expensive failure, has more to do with Ubisoft's generic game design and greed more so than Disney's. Because Disney let them do whatever they wanted, which is why the Ultimate Edition is overpriced, and it's got so many shitty problems by extension. The most Disney has to blame for that is licensing Star Wars to Ubisoft in the first place. The problem may ironically be that the leadership is unironically awful. Kathleen Kennedy is the head honcho of Star Wars, correct? She's the one who has all the terrible ideas and leadership skills when she turns Star Wars into her very own whorehouse. And the one area that she is not is the video game department. Because as I said, Disney doesn't give a shit about video games or the gaming industry. That's why that's the only opportunity we're getting for quality content. But it's also a double-edged sword, given its potential for game companies to be even more unhinged than Disney, without a central leader making the decisions on where the franchise is going to go. As a comparison, if you analyze the failure of modern Xbox, a big problem is that Phil Spencer has the mentality of letting studios under Microsoft do whatever they want. While it allows for creative freedom, it isn't balanced out by an effective leader giving the studios deadlines and practical decisions to make sure the game comes out great. So if, say, Bethesda Game Studios makes a lethal mistake in their game design that hurts the final product, it would be on Phil Spencer to point that out. It's a balancing act, with being an overseer on a project one of your studios is making, without being too much of a corporate hassle. In regards to what's happening to Star Wars, everything but the video games is a result of bad decisions made directly by Kathleen Kennedy, hiring idiots who share her deluded vision of the world to write Star Wars stories, with only the video games overlooked. I mean, you gotta remember that despite the failure of modern Xbox, they still managed to put out some pretty good games, like Hi-Fi Rush, but you might also remember they discarded the studio soon afterwards. I also feel like a similar thing is happening to Marvel as it is with Star Wars. As you might recall that Marvel games vary vastly in quality across the different studios. The first Insomniac Spider-Man was really good, but it was followed by an Air spin-off and a sequel that was actually a huge letdown, not gonna lie, and a hypocritical mess, given it had gay flags everywhere except in the Arabic version. Yeah, so much for Pride Month. We've also had Marvel's Avengers, which was a failure, and other games, like Midnight Suns, which from what I've seen was generally positive in reception, but was nothing special and so on. You see what I mean? The games come out to varying different degrees of quality, and even though Insomniac made 3 different Spider-Man games, ironically the first one was the best, and the 2 games afterwards were vastly inferior. While I do prefer Jedi Survivor over Fallen Order, there is a stigma that Fallen Order was the better game. So there are still hints of even Respawn Entertainment not stepping things up to the extent that we get a way better game. So in an ideal world, we would have a competent or even inspired leader of Lucasfilm who knows the balance between being a stern leader but also not being too intrusive. And in the mainstream department, aka the movies and shows, Kathleen Kennedy's doing a terrible job, but in the video game division, she's not doing a job at all. But it's highly preferable, since that actually allows for quality content to come out once in a while, even if it's a double-edged sword. I should also mention this is probably why video game releases are so infrequent. Because if Disney don't give a fuck about video games, they're not prioritizing them to be made as often. It's a gamble once they do pick a studio to make a video game, because they might either be creatively inspired or greedy or desperate to milk the Star Wars brand for what it's worth. You might recall that within EA itself, they cancelled a lot of Star Wars games, including Project Ragtag, a promising smuggler-based game developed by Amy Hennig, who of course was a major player at Naughty Dog, before the studio was ruined by Neil Cuckman and the bullshit he's pulling nowadays. So yeah, in an ideal world, we'd have an inspired leader who knows what to prioritize in projects going on at Lucasfilm. realm. I think this context and perspectives explains a hell of a lot about why the Jedi games passed the baseline, and came with zero controversies regarding ruining or abandoning Star Wars. Fallen Order was met with backlash for having a trailer that spoiled Darth Vader's brief appearance, and Jedi Survivor was met with backlash for having a buggy launch. But neither of those have to do with fucking over the source material, or being made out of spite for Star Wars. I think it's also backed up by the fact that Disney will shit out most of everything, except video games. Like, they're still trying to make movies, even if one hasn't come out in a while. It's just because of KKK's incompetent leadership that we haven't seen squat after the rise of Skinwalker. They have more of a priority over shitting out novels, with people barely being able to keep up over video games. Something far more accessible and far more likely to make money. Now, with that being said, that's my extended explanation on why the Jedi games meet the quality control baseline, and why they aren't god-awful. But with that being said, with Stig Asmussen out of the picture, there is a possibility that whoever takes over Respawn next may just be Neil Cuckman's inbred cousin and will ruin everything with the third Jedi game and whatever the fuck Respawn makes next, including whatever Jedi 3 will be called. I hope it does not come to that, but that's what a change of ship captains can do. There will be different mentalities on how to make a game, and I just hope that Jedi 3 isn't The Last of Us Part 2 Star Wars edition, because I would really hate that. So Jedi 3, depending on who takes over as game director, may suck hard, but hopefully they stick to whatever outline Stig Asmussen left, and don't throw in a Jolan one at the start. Yeah, I'm venting really hard about Neil Cuckman indirectly, but I think it's time he learns to not piss players off and trivialize them as racist or sexist, because as much as he thinks that he's an ally, all he's really done is create negative stereotypes about gay, trans, and buff people. How they like to ruin everything and discard characters they actually like. But that's a story for another time. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying that the Loris struck?